Welcome back, human physiology students. This is going to be Wednesday's lecture where we're starting chapter 1, which is all about maintaining homeostasis through feedback loops. And this is only going to be part of the whole chapter. I'll finish the rest of it with a separate Zoom video on Friday. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to look at the PowerPoint. We're going to talk about this material. Okay. All right. Okay. So here's our introduction, all right? Our objectives are to understand homeostasis and feedback loops. And I mentioned in the introduction on Monday that the whole human physiology is focused on feedback loops, how the body is regulated, okay? This concept about pathways and feedback loops, I'm going to hit on that again and again and again and again through all the chapters in this course. And that is the most important thing I'm going to be teaching you in physiology. And so we're starting it right at the forefront with chapter 1. Okay, and then we'll end this chapter with a little review of chemistry in terms of biochemistry and show how pH is important for maintaining homeostasis. Okay, so on the first lecture on Monday, I taught you about if you're not pre-nursing, this might not be the course for you. And I also want to remind you here today that none of the material is on Blackboard, all right? I have a Blackboard page, but I really don't post anything on it. It crashes a lot, so everything is simply on my online web page, and there's a link on this PowerPoint to that, and I've also emailed you the link. Okay, so let's start. Okay, homeostasis, physiology. Physiology is going to be very different from anatomy. You learned anatomy, hopefully you've taken it before you signed up for this course, because I only review it quickly, but knowing where the parts and pieces are and what they're called is a challenge to be sure in terms of memorization. But in physiology, you're going to have to know how the organ systems communicate with each other and how they're regulated in order to maintain body functions within a narrow range. Okay, and in nursing, you're going to learn lots of normal ranges for blood pH, for body temperature, for respiratory rate, for blood pressure, for blood glucose, and on and on and on. Okay, now homeostasis is how the body keeps vital functions within normal range. Homeostasis is really keeping the body at a constant state, but you're never at a constant state. What you do is you fluctuate up and down within a normal range. And you only have problems when the body has a body function that's outside of normal range, either too high or too low. Okay, so the main systems that you learned in anatomy that regulate homeostasis is the nervous system through electrical impulses or action potentials. Your brain is the major regulator of the rest of your body's functions and how your body maintains homeostasis. But that's not the only regulatory system. The other one is the endocrine system, and that is through secretory glands that secrete hormones, which are chemical messengers, and they also regulate the body. All right, so those are the two main systems. We'll be talking a lot about them. So let's think about, as nurses, someone comes into the hospital and they're going to sit with you first before they go to the doctor. So what you're going to do is you're going to get their name, you're going to have their file, you're going to look through their file, and first of all, you're going to measure some vital statistics immediately, all right? You want to know if some vital body functions are within normal range. Okay, so if you think about it, what are some of the things, I'm going to exit this full screen so we can think about it. If you're thinking right now, what's the first thing that happens when you go into the doctor's office and sit with the nurse? What's one of the first things they measure on you, right? Maybe body temperature, okay? That's a good one. They might stick a thermometer in your mouth, okay? What's another one? If you thought blood pressure, you're right. Right, that's a pretty normal vital function to take. How about this one? They might measure your body weight, get you on a scale. They might measure your respiratory rate, especially if you have respiratory problems in your file. What happens if they have in your file that you're a diabetic? They might measure your blood glucose, okay? And then they might measure some other things. So I'll just put etc. All right, and so then you write that down, and then the doctor knows when they get that file, oh, everything looks within normal range, or uh-oh, their blood pressure was a little higher than normal. Well, that's what you're doing as nurses, okay? Now, so this is why we talk about how the body regulates these things. In fact, right here, body temperature, blood pressure, and blood glucose. we're going to learn in this chapter how the body regulates those to within a normal range and what the body does if those body functions either go too high or too low. All right. Okay, so let's continue on with our PowerPoint. I'll go through that. Okay, now here's the component parts of homeostasis and a feedback loop. So we'll start with number one. The stimulus is a change in body function where it could be blood pressure, heart rate, it could be blood glucose, it could be a number of things, body temperature. And let's say it's body temperature. Let's say body temperature rises above normal. That's a stimulus. It's now drifted outside that normal range. If it goes outside that range, that's going to be a stimulus. So what happens is there's going to be sensors for that body function. So if I was talking about body temperature, we have thermal receptors that are sensors. They detect that change outside normal range. They send a signal to the integrating center, and the integrating center is where that information is processed, interpreted. It's compared to a set point or a normal range, and then that integrating center can send a command. It's either a nervous system command or an endocrine command to an effector in the body. Effectors are muscle cells or glands that respond to that command. Okay, muscle cells could be either skeletal muscles you have control over, or heart muscle, or smooth muscle in the body. Okay, now at the end of this pathway, the end effect is usually to reverse that change so that it comes back to within normal range. Okay, so let's talk about an applied version of this feedback loop. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, feedback loops. We have two of them in the body. One is a positive feedback loop, and that is a very rare feedback loop. And that's when a body system goes outside of normal range. It's sensed. Integrating center receives the information, and what it does is it stimulates more of that effect. All right, so it amplifies an effect. All right, and we'll talk about specific examples, but it's the rare feedback loop. Now, a negative feedback loop is the most common. That's what we're going to be spending most of our time on this semester. All right, and that's what you've got to know in nursing. Okay, so whenever a body function goes outside of normal range, maybe something goes up too high, maybe something drops down too low outside of that normal range, that's a stimulus. And what will happen at the end of the negative feedback loop is you get a reversal of that to bring it back within normal range. So what that means is if a body function rises too high, like body temperature rises too high, at the end of this feedback loop, hopefully it will bring it back down to normal range. And the opposite is also true. If a body function goes too low, at the end of the feedback loop, it'll bring it back up to normal range. And so that's negative feedback. Okay, so let's start looking at some examples. Positive feedback. This is one of the rare ones. And the one I've got here is lactation. All right, so nursing a child and oxytocin release. So the first step is a stimulus. And in this case of a child nursing, getting breast milk, it's the suckling on the nipple. And the nipple has touch receptors. Okay, I think anatomy they call them Merkel cells or something like that. But those are your touch and pressure receptors in the nipple. Now, once they're stimulated by a child nursing, the sensors send information to an integrating center that also acts as the effector. The integrating center is your hypothalamus. All right, that is a structure in your brain. You learned about that. It's something that's just below the thalamus and just above the pituitary gland. That hypothalamus has a lot of nuclei in it, and one group of them called the paraventricular nucleus releases oxytocin. So that's an effector. That's something that's secreting a hormone. Oxytocin, you've probably heard of it before, but that is a hormone that travels through the body and it causes milk letdown from the mammary glands. You probably didn't know this, but in a mother that's nursing, she produces milk in mammary glands, but they won't release that milk to the nipple unless oxytocin is the bloodstream. Oxytocin gives permission to the mammary glands to actually release the milk. Okay, so the end effect is milk is released from the milk ducts. Now, as long as that baby is suckling, it keeps stimulating the nipple. It causes the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes milk letdown. As the baby keeps nursing, more oxytocin, more milk letdown. As soon as the baby stops nursing and the nipple's no longer stimulated, then the hypothalamus won't release oxytocin anymore and the process stops. But it keeps going until the stimulus goes away. Okay, next example. Okay, another feedback loop involving oxytocin, but this time it's childbirth. Okay, in the previous example, with stimulation of the nipple during breastfeeding, you get oxytocin release, but it's just a little bit of oxytocin, so you get a little bit of milk release. Here's something else oxytocin causes to happen. It stimulates the smooth muscle of the uterus to contract. Okay, so in this example, the stimulus is, oh, here's the baby in the proper head down position for birth. And when that baby's head starts pressing on the cervix right here, that's a stimulus, okay? And in that cervix, you have stretch receptors known as baroreceptors. And when those stretch receptors are signaled, the information about being stretched goes to the integrating center and effector, again as the hypothalamus. And it's going to release a bunch of oxytocin. And you're going to get a corresponding increase in the response of the cells. So when all that oxytocin floods the mom's bloodstream, what happens is there's uterine contractions, very strong uterine contractions. And what that causes to happen is it squeezes the baby more into the birth canal, which causes the cervix to stretch more, which causes the hypothalamus to release more oxytocin, which pushes the baby further through the birth canal, which causes more stretching, and on and on and on it goes until the baby has cleared the birth canal and the cervix is no longer being stretched. And when it's no longer being stretched, stops the oxytocin secretion. All right, so kind of understand how that happens. It's a positive feedback loop. Now there's a huge difference in the amount of oxytocin released with childbirth. It's a huge amount, and you get really big uterine contractions. In the lactation, breastfeeding a child, you get a little bit of oxytocin release, and anyone who's ever nursed a child knows this to be true. You have milk letdown, and you also get mild uterine contractions. So when a woman is breastfeeding her child, it causes the uterus to contract a little bit. And that's one of the benefits of breastfeeding, is it can help tone that uterus back up after childbirth. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a couple of negative feedback examples. We won't get to all of them, but we'll start with one. Body temperature. Okay, negative feedback. I want you to pay attention to the arrows. Okay, so our body temperature is 98.6. In some individuals it's a little lower, and some it's a little higher. But really we've got a range of about 97.6 to 99.6. That's our range, okay? Now we're going to start with what happens if body temperature goes too high, okay? So if the stimulus is you're too hot, your body temperature is above that range, what will happen is you have receptors called thermoreceptors throughout your body, on the skin and inside your body. And what they will do is if they detect temperatures too high, they send a signal to the integrating center. Oh, guess what? It's the hypothalamus again. But it's going to be a different nucleus. It's going to be the anterior nucleus. When I think of the anterior nucleus, I think of the ant part. And I think Antarctica. Antarctica is a continent, isn't it? In fact, it's a cold continent. In fact, that's a temperature. So when I think Antarctica, anterior nucleus, I think temperature. Okay, now what happens is the hypothalamus, the integrating center, sends a signal to an effector. In this case, it's going to be your sweat glands, okay? Effectors are muscle cells or glands, and this is causes you to sweat. And when that sweat evaporates off the surface of your skin, it carries body heat with it, and it cools you down. So the end effect is your body temperature goes back down to normal range. So with negative feedback, the stimulus, the arrow is going in one direction. At the end of the negative feedback pathway, the arrow is going in the opposite direction, and that's the key to knowing it's negative feedback. Okay, so what happens when your body temperature drops too low? So that's the stimulus. The same sensors detect it, the same integrating center responds, but what it stimulates is something different. Its effectors that are stimulated are going to be your skeletal muscles, and you'll shiver, right? And when your skeletal muscles contract on and off, they're going to produce heat, and that's going to warm your body, and that's going to bring your body temperature back up to within normal range. Okay, so this is a classic case of negative feedback. What happens when body temperature is too high? Well, gotta get it down. What happens when body temperature is too low? Gotta get it back up. That's what the body can do. Now, if you take this and think about what can happen to the human body in a real world situation as future nurses, someone could come in to the hospital with heat stroke. And what has happened to them is their body temperature has risen too much. Maybe they were working too hard in the August sun. It's 99 degrees with 100% humidity, and they didn't hydrate themselves enough or take enough breaks. And eventually, their body stops sweating. And when that happens, that is an emergency. When someone's body temperature is so high that they have stopped sweating, the body's kind of said, negative feedback sign said, okay, honey, I can't do anything about it from this point on. You're going to die. And as nurses, if someone comes in with heat exhaustion, you got to cool them down, hydrate them quickly before they die. Same thing can happen when you're too cold. If someone's hypothermic, like they've been out in the cold in the winter in cold temperatures and have exposure, when the muscles stop shivering, when someone's so cold and they stop shivering, that's an emergency. That's a danger sign. That's the body saying, I can't fix it anymore. I'm done. And that's an emergency. Okay, so let's go on to the next feedback loop. So before I get too far, on the syllabus, I have a blank flow diagram for temperature regulation and a key. And this is a reminder to practice what we just went over, okay? Okay, now regulation of blood glucose. Okay, we'll probably stop there for today. Okay, in the PD, if you're going to stay as nurses in the future and work in the PD, there's the big three. The big three health conditions you're going to see. One, high blood pressure, hypertension, and that's a killer left untreated. Number two, cardiovascular disease. Number three, diabetes. Okay, so as a future nurse, you really need to understand how the body regulates blood glucose, because then you can understand when the body's having a problem regulating blood glucose, like diabetes, and then understanding how pharmacological drugs can help treat diabetes. Okay, so the stimulus is simply going to be a change in blood glucose outside of its normal range. And our first lab online experiment is about blood glucose regulation. So this all ties together tightly. That lab is going to be next week. So depending on what your blood glucose levels are, let's look at the first stimulus. Let's say blood glucose is too high. If you just ate a meal or you just drank a sugary beverage, like a full sugar Pepsi, within about 30 minutes or so, that stuff is going to go from your stomach to your intestines. That blood's going to hit your, that glucose is going to hit your bloodstream, and it's going to rise your blood glucose up, okay? So what the body's going to do is to bring that down, it's going to have negative feedback. So the stimulus is blood glucose is too high. The sensor, the integrating center, and the effector are all in one place, the pancreas. Okay, the pancreas will respond, the beta cells of the pancreas will respond by secreting insulin. Now you probably know that insulin brings blood glucose down, but you probably didn't know how it does that. Insulin tells your body cells to take in glucose from the bloodstream and use it for their metabolism. Primarily fat cells, the liver cells, and skeletal muscles, and your brain uses a lot of glucose. When that glucose is removed from the bloodstream, it lowers the glucose in the bloodstream. So the end effect is you get a decrease in blood glucose because your body's cells have taken it in and used it. All right, so that's what insulin does. When blood glucose is too high, it'll tell your cells to use the glucose, remove it from the bloodstream, drops your blood glucose. All right, so that's insulin. Now, if your blood glucose drops too low, now the stimulus is it's too low. Let's say you skipped some meals, all right? Or you did a long endurance run or played basketball or soccer or something like that for an hour or two. You're going to deplete your blood glucose and it's going to drop. Another way blood glucose can drop, maybe a more human health related, like nursing related way it can drop is, let's say you have a patient that's in the hospital and they're really, really sick. Maybe they're taking chemotherapy or they're just really sick and they're not eating. Their blood glucose is going to drop. Okay, so the stimulus is it drops. The sensor, integrating center, and effector are the same thing, the pancreas, but it's going to secrete a different hormone. It's going to secrete glucagon. Now I think of the word glucagon, I think glucose is gone, okay? And what that hormone will do is it will go to your liver and it'll tell your liver to break down glycogen. Glycogen is a storage form of glucose in the liver, and it has it there in case you face lean times. So the glucagon tells the liver to break down its glycogen stores into glucose and to release that glucose into the bloodstream. As a result, your blood glucose goes up because your liver is just as important as your pancreas in regulating your blood glucose. I don't know if you knew that, but that's true. Okay, now thinking about blood glucose regulation. Let's say someone has diabetes mellitus. Okay, there's two types. There's type 1 and there's type 2, and you'll see both of them. They're very common. In type 1 diabetes, what's the problem? I mean, what's not working in type 1 diabetes? All right, it's also called insulin dependent diabetes. Okay, type 1 diabetes is where the pancreas, the beta cells, aren't producing enough insulin. It's an autoimmune disorder, believe it or not. And it's not enough insulin to regulate your blood glucose, and that's a problem. So these people are the ones that must monitor their blood glucose throughout the day. And when it rises, since they don't have enough internal production of insulin, they have to inject themselves with insulin and carefully do that. Okay, so that's type 1. Type 2 diabetes, it's called non-insulin dependent, but now they call it insulin resistance. What's the problem with that? It used to be called geriatric diabetes, but they don't call it that anymore because a lot more children are coming down with it. Any ideas? Okay, it's called insulin resistance. What happens is it's usually a lifetime of poor diet, poor exercise, or you've got a genetic component, which is also very powerful. And for whatever reason, your tissues stop responding to the insulin that is being produced. There's plenty of insulin. That ain't the problem. The problem is your tissues stop responding and they don't take in that blood glucose. And so your blood glucose is high. That type of diabetes is a little tougher to treat. And it's just as dangerous. Okay, so type 1, type 2 diabetes, common forms of diabetes. Okay, now, since we were talking about blood glucose regulation, I want you to remember to go to the syllabus and click on the blank flow diagram of blood glucose regulation and the key, okay? And I want you to start practicing filling those out, all right? Okay, so our next negative feedback loop, which I'm not going to get into today, we'll pick this up on Friday because I don't want this Zoom video to be too long. We'll talk about blood pressure regulation and how the body does that. Okay, so I'll keep you a little bit excited. I won't steal the thunder for Friday's lecture, but that's what we're going to talk about then. And we'll have a lab, hopefully to be in person, where we look at this exact kind of experiment that I'm going to talk about next time. So let me stop sharing the screen and come back to the video. All right, so that's the first material. We'll finish it up on Friday, and this Zoom video will be posted. And what I will do is probably next Monday, not this Monday coming up, is I'll email you out a link with office hours, probably at 10:30, so you can ask any questions that you have on the first chapter of material. Okay, so until Friday, I will talk to you later.